I'm all in on Kiro.dev, and in this video, I'm going to explain why I think you should be as well. For context, I'm Sebastian Tamburo, no background in computer science or software development or no formal education, and 100% self-taught through countless hours, countless projects, and a lot of money. So before I get into this, I just kind of wanted to talk about my views on what's going on right now. So AI is just modern technology. Modern technology is just growing exponentially, and I find that there's a gap between what the technology is actually able to do versus what people think it can do, and this kind of like discrepancy or inefficiency for my econ guy people out there has created this gray area where there's no formal guidance when it comes to where to start if you're someone trying to get into AI or figure out how you can leverage AI to get yourself the competitive edge, whether it's as an entrepreneur to buy back some time, whether you're a business trying to figure out how you could streamline some workflows and empower your current workforce, or on the individual side of things, if you're a student trying to get into a particular field, right? It's inevitable that it's shifting the labor market. It's going to kind of kill the entry level jobs in various fields, and so I think it's extremely important to get into it if you haven't already. But needless to say, it's confusing, and the goal of this channel is to essentially just give you unedited, raw information and share my experience as much as possible to kind of help people who are going through what I went through when it comes to going through that trial and error process, and hopefully save them some time and cut the learning curve, uh, giving them some sort of guidance and insight that I wish I had back when I was just starting out. So onto Kiro.dev. Basically, what I've learned, I've tried all the low-code platforms. I've tried all the vibe coding applications or web apps like Lovable, like Replit, Figma. If I could go back, the first thing I would tell people is to get directly into a terminal. One thing that I see with AI nowadays is that people want to use it for ease. They love the idea that it can basically supplement and substitute a task or a skill or the actual process of doing something, right? Where it actually should serve as an enhancement to that process, not a substitute. And what I find is that a lot of these platforms, they not as much N8N, but most of them will kind of lean towards the substitute side of that spectrum. And so what I always recommend people is start with Cursor, start with VS Code, and what I'm telling you is to start with Kiro. And if you're on another platform, get into Kiro.dev, especially if you're someone like me with no formal background or formal education. So with that being said, the reason for this is these IDE platforms allow you to actually understand you have to have a generic understanding of the basics when it comes to software developing. And it's always funny how I find in a lot of aspects of my life, things always come back to the basics. So AI can do all these phenomenal things, but as an individual, if you're looking to leverage AI, it is now more than ever extremely beneficial to understand the basics, because everyone and their mother is just trying to build something or build an application. And the real way to kind of separate yourself is to understand the kind of like the foundational concepts of computer science and software. I'm actively still trying to fill in those gaps. I try to get into cloud computing and understand cloud computing. I have an MCP connected to my Kiro instance, which I'll get to in a second. That's doing a lot of that for me, but understanding it is very important. Just like understanding how to operate in a terminal, different commands, the generic commands, what is actually going on. is very helpful and saves you a shit ton of time, because at the end of the day, you don't want to use AI to completely substitute the development process. You need to use it as a way to streamline the development process and enhance your abilities to develop. So Kiro.dev now, there's Cursor, there's VS Code, there's, I think, Windsurf, I don't know them. They're all relatively the same. What the big difference is this idea of spec-driven development. And essentially, as you kind of progress from, beginner level to more advanced builds and projects, you start to realize that it's all about staying organized and providing models with the necessary context and up-to-date context on what it is that you're building, especially if you're vibe coding. And the reason for this is that you always want the model to understand what the task is at hand, some mistakes that it's made in the past, where the code base is, and what kind of like step you're at in the development process. And what I've done in the past using Cursor and a lot of these other platforms is I will actually use another model to plan out the development process and break it up into chunk-sized pieces. So like I'll even do like 5 main phases, and then have like multiple chunks within each phase, and then have a resource document or reference document, which is called the product requirement document, that is consistently being retrieved and updated after every single chunk. And little did I know that is what spec-driven, or one of the fundamental elements of spec-driven development is. And so essentially what that means for you guys is this is already built into the platform. So not only does it plan out that product requirement document, but it'll actually plan out the design and break it into tasks for you before even writing a single line of code. And for people who don't have the background like myself, it took me months, and I would say over a year, to kind of figure that process out and what the value was when it comes to developing that skill set of being very intentional and progressive when it comes to developing, not just like prioritizing that first model. Because one thing that a lot of people don't talk about is once you kind of like come up with junk, it's way harder to clean the junk and make it look nice. Make chicken salad out of chicken, I'm not going to finish it, but SHIT, than it is to kind of like start from the ground up and take your time and work your way gradually to that end product. So what Kiro does is it kind of takes you through that process automatically. Now, for people who are a little bit more advanced, I would say, this can sometimes be a little bit frictional for the development process, but for the most part, it doesn't hurt. Another great thing is just the versioning history. You can actually see current versions or past versions. Hold on, I have my clicker here. I don't know if it's going to let me click. But yes, you can see past versions, connecting your GitHub to your Kiro instance. And yeah, so that's the biggest takeaway. And then once you it's just very user friendly, especially for those who don't understand this step-by-step process and are trying to build big, robust, projects and betas, and can't figure out and are stuck in that AI slop fixing with AI. This could be a great solution. On top of it, I just would say it's way more user friendly and designed for people who are building more advanced solutions that don't understand this kind of like spec-driven development process. And it just makes everything so much more intuitive. From, there's source control, like I said. You could run and debug, you can create like customized runs. And I want to talk about this part. So there's some extensions that are phenomenal, like the Mermaid chart, which allows you to really design and plan out your build. If you know what a Mermaid chart is, it looks like it has like those boxes, and you could it's a very robust designing tool, or I don't know if it's a language or a tool, but it's great for when you're developing and coming up with that product requirement document. Um, and often I'll use it and I'll prompt a model when I'm in the planning phase to come up with some web diagrams and etc. Or sorry, Mermaid diagrams to help visualize the build for the actual model. So another thing that we're going to get into is once you get into the specs, you'll see things like tasks. You'll see so tasks is like the product requirement document plus the tasks, and then you'll see the design, and these are kind of like your baseline reference documents that the model, when it's actually building, will utilize as consistent context that it can always pull from when it's building at all times, right? Because these models, they have context windows, and if you surpass the context window, whatever comes outside of it or whatever is new will kick out the old stuff. This way, it's always accessible. This information is like the heartbeat of the actual build. Now, with agent hooks, this is pretty cool. I haven't found it very helpful yet, but this is where someone who has a, I guess more of an advanced understanding of the error handling process when it comes to building a large code base, you can create these automations that automatically complete one task for that build. So whether that's, automatically testing when you're adding a new element to your framework or a new page to ensure that, it seems flawlessly, or it runs seamlessly with the rest of your development that you've already built out. So that's really cool, and you could get really robust with these. But personally, I always find that even if you have these agent hooks, like, the model makes mistakes sometimes. So it can honestly, for me, I find that it causes more headaches than it does fixes them. But if you have some good hooks that you utilize that you think are very helpful and that have streamlined your process, I'd love to give them a try. I just haven't had success with them. I'd rather address the problem on my own. And then agent steering is another cool tool. So this is where you can actually continuously, I guess, enhance these spec-driven documents or these spec documents. So here's where you can continuously update the information and provide it with more and more context that is readily available for any part of the development process. And like I said, that context window is only so big for these models, right? And if it's outside of that context window, it doesn't know how to reference it, right? It doesn't know what it's talking about. It needs to generate the necessary content. So if you have a massive, massive application that you're building with hundreds and hundreds of pages, I'd imagine your code base is built up of, I guess, thousands of, or a ton of different files and documents. And so asking the model to go sift through is kind of inefficient. This is where you could take actual documents, you can actually give it like prompts and put it into these steering docs and have it intuitively and dynamically reference those documents no matter how big the actual code base is. I've found it personally saves me a lot of time, especially when it comes to if I'm focusing on one particular part of the developing process. Let's say I have the entire backhand build out, the functionalities build out of my application, and I want to focus on design. I could kind of like give it the designing approaches that I want, or more context on how I want my build or user interface to be designed. And I think that could be very helpful. And then lastly, what I love is these things they called powers, and these are just MCP servers, but what you could, if I pull this up, this just makes these very intuitive for and user friendly for those who are not kind of at the MCP level. But basically what these MCPs can do is, if you know what an API call is, it's essentially any kind of tool that you do on an application, or any function that you can do on an application. So let's say I always use some sort of like Excel sheet, for an example, or a database. If you want to get one row, right, you copy that row and you want to pull it on and paste it into Google Docs, right? The functionality of getting that one row is like one API call. And then think about all the other things. You could go create a sheet, you could delete a sheet, you could do this, and that. An MCP is compiled of all of those, or for the most of those core functionalities, and it's kind of a model that you could attach to your instance and have all of those API calls bundled up into one nice package that you just, instead of configuring each one of those calls, right? So like, I'm not going to get into the weeds, but it just bundles it all up and packages it so that you can connect it directly with your IDE, a model, and have it intuitively make those decisions for you, as opposed to you hard coding those API calls into whatever, I guess, workflow or project that you have. They're very powerful, especially in development process. So like I said, for someone who doesn't have a strong background in cloud computing, which is one of the most robust elements of and most complicated elements of software and hosting, I'm learning. But I utilize this MCP. Where is it? So like, it actually is created by AWS, and it allows you to host and create cloud infrastructure for your application automatically. Now the issue comes with the whole element of AWS, can really compound in terms of pricing. So for me, someone who is, hosting a large variety of enterprise solutions on our own cloud instance, I have to be particularly careful with how these kind of build out and how these manifest in the actual cloud in terms of the cost, if they're efficient, right? And so that's why I'm learning and trying to wrap my head and understand the basics, right, of cloud computing. But very powerful stuff here. And then lastly is yes, so if you don't know what Agent Core is Amazon's, I guess, N8N, but just for agent configuration. So you could just build agents and host them directly within AWS's cloud interface. And it's a super powerful tool. You get access to phenomenal models. Anyways, this is the MCP. So you could literally build out agents within that Agent Core platform, have them hosted on your AWS instance, and connect them into whatever it is that you're building, whether it's some sort of user interface or an application. It all can be done through plain English communication. But you do have to be very intentional with the way you're prompting, what you're looking for, and being very clear in terms of having an outline with the spec-driven approach, and making sure that you fill it with as much context as possible, and you're consistently thinking about how you're enhancing the model for this specific request, and how you're outlining it and breaking it and compartmentalizing the actual step-by-step process, not only of the build or the specific feature that you're building up, but the actual prompt and what it should do. And I could get into that in later videos. But yeah, that's overall a generic breakdown of Kiro.dev. I think it's a phenomenal tool. I will be using it quite a bunch going forward, and we'll get into a lot more developing videos, but I just wanted to give it a generic review before I actually dive deep into building out some stuff and showcasing to you how I personally develop with this interface and platform, and reap the benefits of the spec-driven development. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.